Hello again, 102. In part 3, we will discuss Roosevelt and his contributions to the progressive movement. And both Roosevelt and Taft are the original modern presidents. They will increase the power of the presidency, just as Andrew Jackson did in the 1830s and Lincoln did during the Civil War. Now, these two gentlemen will continue that with the progressive era and some of the changes that are facing modern society and the problems that need to be corrected. But Taft will not be as energetic as his good friend, and that will eventually lead to a break between the two men, and the result that will split the Republican Party. And because the Republicans split their vote, as we'll see, Woodrow Wilson will become the first Democrat since Grover Cleveland to hold the executive office. And Roosevelt called his plan the Square Deal, the progressive agenda of the 3 C's, and he will evolve way beyond this, as we'll see: control of corporations, conservation of natural resources, and consumer protection. In his view, big businesses were not bad because they were big, but it was because they don't behave properly, they are unethical, or they use unfair business practices like the rebate in order to gain advantage over their competitors. Roosevelt, from his upbringing and his life, had a commitment to fair play in sports, in business, and in politics. And his version of progressivism at this time is on a commitment to equal opportunity. He's an umpire in the relations between business and the consumer. And only 5 months into his presidency, he stunned financiers when he ordered the breakup, told the Attorney General to break up the Northern Securities Company that ran rail and steamships in a portion of the country owned by J.P. Morgan. Morgan said, "I'll send my man and he can meet your man and we can fix this up." And they said, "No, we're not doing business as it was done in the late 19th century. That time has passed." And Morgan held a grudge against Roosevelt for a long time. When Roosevelt leaves office in 1909 and he goes big game hunting with his son in Africa, Mr. Morgan was heard to comment that he hopes that the lions will do their duty. The Elkins Act was passed in the following year, which made it illegal for that rebate method to be used for high-volume customers. That was a favorite move of John D. Rockefeller. And also they created that same year the Bureau of Corporations, which will be monitoring the activities of big business. And when Standard Oil refused to turn over its records, the government brought an antitrust suit that led to the breakup of the company, eventually during the Taft administration. Washington Gladden led a petition to urge Theodore Roosevelt to step into the coal strike, which really threatened the country on the eve of the winter of 1902. So Roosevelt decided to invite the leaders of the coal mining regions in West Virginia and Pennsylvania to the White House, along with their union representatives. He appealed to their patriotism, to the spirit that sinks personal considerations and makes individual sacrifices for the public good. The mine owners came, but they refused to even speak to the United Mine Workers leaders. And Roosevelt just could not believe that. He eventually broke the strike by threatening to send in soldiers to run the mines. And eventually they compromised. The workers got a 10% wage increase, and they got shorter hours. Again, the perennial demands of labor: better hours, better conditions, and pay. There we go. Spit it out, Eugene. Better pay as well. And they got some concessions, but the owners of the mines still refuse to recognize the United Mine Workers. And it's not going to be until the 30s under the New Deal that unions are formally recognized in the United States under the Wagner Act. And this is a cool cartoon Roosevelt's Hercules, battling the trusts and pro-corporation senators like Nelson Aldrich. He's reelected on his own in 1904. He's no longer an accidental president. Huge electoral victory over Alton Parker. Parker was an interesting Democratic candidate. He was very dull, and this is one of the worst defeats that the Democratic Party ever had. I guess Parker's big claim to fame, according to the textbook, was that he had taught his pigs how to come when called by name. Boy, that's an interesting way to run for the presidency. And now he's got a serious mandate to implement more progressive policies that will further his square deal. And now they are controlling corporations with the Hepburn Act, which sets maximum freight rates for the railroad industry. They will pass the Pure Food and Drug Act, as we'll see in a moment, meat inspection. Roosevelt in 1906 read the famous novel The Jungle by the muckraker Upton Sinclair, which detailed the conditions in meatpacking factories, and it was disgusting. In the one part of the book, Sinclair mentions that one of the workers said, we used to scrape the rat dung off of these hides, and it would all get swept together into the vats, all mixed together. Rat dung, rat poison, tainted meat, and nobody knows exactly what they were eating in those days. And because of that, Roosevelt was appalled, and he convinced the Congress to pass this Meat Inspection Act. And this is part of the United States Agriculture Department now, and we still have this system today. And as I just mentioned, this was also passed in the same year, and that's when cocaine was eliminated from Coca-Cola, ladies and gentlemen. Coca-Cola in the 1890s and early part of the century used to be prescribed for melancholia, for what ails you, and it would be a little bit of a pick-me-up in order to get you out of that state. Women used to drink Coca-Cola for that reason, because many women, as you know, are only domestic servants, and many intelligent women in the 1890s were diagnosed with this melancholia because they would start to go insane, and Coca-Cola helped them. No longer after this time. The best thing Roosevelt did for the United States was conservation. And it was, again, one of the pillars of the square deal. He was an avid outdoorsman and naturalist, as we saw in an earlier video. He's an amateur scientist. And with Gifford Pinchot, the chief forester, the first trained forester in the United States running this conservation program for Roosevelt, they create all these wildlife refuges. They created national parks, bird sanctuaries, and they designated 18 national monuments, including the Grand Canyon. These areas are now off limits to exploitation by business. And they used the Forest Reserve Act, which was already on the books, to protect 172 million acres of federally owned forests from being logged, much to the chagrin of the lumber companies. But Roosevelt didn't back down, because I hate a man who skins the land. Overall, 234 million acres of federal land for conservation purposes and 45 national forests in 11 western states will be preserved. And Pinchot said that this was the most significant achievement of Theodore Roosevelt. And many of these areas are still protected today. But you have to remember that Gifford Pinchot and Roosevelt are not tree huggers. They believe in using science, again, ladies and gentlemen, to use these natural resources. They're not there to be kept there untouched forever, but we have to figure out how to use them more efficiently and in the interest of the public good, not just for the individual needs of business. Roosevelt has a checkered history with race relations and in bringing equality to African Americans. He is not successful. Roosevelt is a man of his times, and he has been influenced by social Darwinism. Here he's meeting with Booker T. Washington while still a vice president, and after he was elected, or not after he was elected, but after he took the office, he invited Booker T again to meet with him in the White House for dinner. And this led to a backlash from the South, specifically from the Memphis Scimitar newspaper. And they are very angry. And now Mr. Tillman makes his thoughts known on what's going to have to be done now as a result of Roosevelt trying to mingle with African Americans. And he's not going to do this again. And he does nothing to advance the need for bringing equality to a citizenry that has been reduced to second-class status by 1900. And that is going to be the flaw in the progressive movement. And we'll be heading into part 4. We will deal with Taft in another video. And Roosevelt makes the political mistake of deciding not to run again because he doesn't want to break the two-term tradition of Washington. Even though he is eligible and he would only be running on his own for the second time, he wants to not do this. And he's going to regret this. And because he doesn't, he would have easily have won again in 1908. And this is going to have unbelievable political consequences for the United States, as we'll see.